Everybody, this is Dean Smith from the Community of Human and Organizational Learning, and I am slowly letting people in from the waiting room and making sure that we have everybody before kicking us off. So thank you very much for taking the time to join us today. And Bob Fisher, Rob Fisher, thank you very much. I got too many Robs and Bobs on this screen right now. I'm sorry. Rob, thrilled to have you with us today to talk about avoiding errors and understanding what potential errors we could encounter in HOP deployment. And I know this comes from your background and working like all over the globe with different companies. So I think it's rooted in both your insights and also real life experiences, if I'm not mistaken. So with that, thrilled to turn it over to you, and the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. I appreciate it, Dean. Again, I'm Rob Fisher. We want to talk a little bit about deploying HOP. A lot of people use HOP as concepts, but the reality is if you want sustainability, you have to deploy them. Most of the people here on the call know me. I own Fisher Improvement Technologies. We've spent the last 30 years helping organizations and individuals understand how and why people make mistakes, especially mistakes that can prove to be catastrophic, and how you can do one of three things with a mistake or an error. You can prevent some, you can reduce their probability, or you can mitigate their consequence. And it just seems like in the HOP space that we've forgotten some of those things. So I'm going to take about an hour, maybe a little bit less today, to run you through some of the things that we have learned. And then I'm going to give you some opportunities near the end. So a little bit of our history for those of you who don't know. We operate in about 40 different countries. We have over 100 super advocates. Those are people that operate at the consultant level within organizations. We've trained about 1,000 certified trainers, and we just had our Fisher IT Operational Excellence Conference last week. We found out some of these numbers were a lot bigger than we thought they were. In fact, just in the room, we've educated about 400,000 workforce personnel. Just in the room, they represented a little over 1 million people. So we don't really know how far it goes sometimes when we're not the primary drivers, but I hope you'll be able to get some nuggets out of what we're going to do today. And some of our clients, again, are represented around the world. So you can maybe look to see your company on there, or look for a company that does what you do. And I only put this up so you realize that when we come to you with these webinars, we're coming from a position of having operated in all of these companies. These are places that we have fully deployed, not companies that I've gone in and just spoke to. But I will give you a conflict alert. And the conflict alert is that I'm tired. I'm tired of the shiny objects. I'm tired of chasing things because people want to change names. I'm tired of hearing people change definitions because they can't figure out how to teach people the definitions the right way and based on the science. I'm just tired. So some of what you're going to see today may seem a little bit brash, and I'll take any input that you have after the fact, but understand it's coming from a place where we improve companies and lives. It's what we do. And if I or our team thinks it's important enough to put on a slide and talk about it, then it may be important enough for y'all to jot down some notes. I shared with Dean and the team that I will provide PDFs of this so that they can be shared with anybody that's on here. And there's ample ways that you can contact us if you want to cuss and discuss after the fact. But if you look at, and part of being tired is not chasing the shiny objects of names and everything else. In the end, what we want to use human and organizational performance for is to create operational excellence and create psychological safety. But you can't do that with parts of HOP, or I call HOP this and you call HOP that, and they call HOP something else, and everybody thinks they're doing HOP. I'm going to talk about a holistic version of human and organizational performance, because if it's done right, it's the enabler, it's the driver for psychological safety and operational excellence. In other words, quality, safety, effectiveness, efficiency, productivity, interactions and engagements with your workforce, interactions and engagements with your stakeholders. All of those things happen as the result of deploying HOP correctly. And oh, by the way, some of them don't happen if you don't deploy hop correctly. So I put together about 5 hop deployment problems, and then I'll talk about each one. The first one is that we've trained leaders. Uh, they're on board, but they're actually not driving the improvements. You hear things like, I support hop, or I'm a big supporter of hop from the leadership, but they're not educated enough and they haven't had to alter their behaviors enough to actually drive the improvement. Second one is the tools for the workforce either were never rolled out or they were rolled out ineffectively. And we'll do some talking about tools. The next one is that the organization thinks that hop can really be done with little or no education or training, especially for the workforce. And when an organization thinks that, they tend to focus on areas that really aren't benefiting the people that might get hurt, maimed, and killed. In other words, they deploy without integrating, and that really results in very few sustainable positive outcomes. You may see some blips, but then the next leader comes in and you don't see the outcome hanging around. And the last one, probably the most important, even though these are usually in no particular order, leaders don't use a system or process for leading human organizational performance. In other words, there's no intentionality behind their hop leadership. It's just part of the other things they're doing. You go out in the field, you ask a leader specifically what concept they're deploying, they can't tell you. So let's look at each of these individually. And the first one is that leaders been trained and they say they're on board, but they're not actually driving the improvements. They have either told somebody to run the program and you created a programmatic document. This was the part of the nuclear model that went out into utilities that didn't work anywhere beyond nuclear. It worked a little bit in nuke, but we'll talk about that later. In other words, leaders were told you either get on board or get out. So they said we're on board, but they didn't know what to do with that. So let's talk about some of the attributes of the difference between being on board and driving it. Everybody you talk to says, well, the leaders have to be trained. And everybody raises up their hand and says their amens. And so what happens is you hear people, you'll even hear them in conversation at conferences or in conversation around the place. Well, we had so-and-so in, and they really jazzed up our leaders. They're ready to go. And in other words, they've checked the box on leader training. The challenge is everybody's running around, yay, we're doing hop. But unfortunately, here in the hop space, too many leaders get a lot of what's and not a lot of how's. And there's a couple of different reasons for that. And one of them is very viable in your organization. They have a low tolerance for the amount of time it takes to learn what they're supposed to do. So we cave and say, as long as the leaders understand what we're doing, as long as they won't buck us, we'll be okay. But remember, even if you go back to Deming, he says knowing what to do is not enough. It's knowing how to do it that makes the difference. And I'm going to say this not as a plug, but as a reality. When I was back in an organization, the leaders didn't have a lot of tolerance for me teaching them what they should do. They didn't mind me giving them information. They didn't mind me telling them the what's, but the how's, I'm not them. The how's almost always need to come from someone external that has experience. They need to understand how to do the things that leaders need to do to make hop work for the sustainable future. And in order to do that, there's some things that the leaders have to be educated on. And what I've done here is I've just highlighted the things that are actions or things they need to do. They need to be educated on the hop principles. Almost everybody does that, but they're usually not educated on how to use them. They need to be educated on the science and the practical applications. In other words, what are we supposed to see and do in our organization as leaders? How do I know if people are doing the right things out there? And how do I know if my leadership team is doing the right things? In other words, they need to understand the methods, processes, and tools of human and organizational performance. They need to understand the leaders' roles and responsibilities. We actually have we call them R2A2, and you may see some of this in some DOE work. Roles, responsibilities, accountabilities, and authorities. That goes all the way up through the leadership team. So you don't have a vice president that doesn't understand their role and responsibility for what's going on with human and organizational performance. And then they get leader tools. Now, in a lot of rollouts, everybody talks about it not being about the worker, but they don't give tools to the leaders. And the reality is it's about everybody. So if you're going to give the workforce and the managers and the supervisors the tools to do what they need to do, the leaders need tools as well, because they have some new knowledge, language, and behaviors that are going to make it work. And they have some bad knowledge, language, and behaviors that are going to make it fail. And they need to understand the importance of that, and that education is step one, step two is integration, and step three is sustainability. So how are we going to use the people that are really doing the work in the organization? So the leaders have to understand what are the roles and responsibilities. How can we do advocate utilization so that we've got a whole bunch of subject matter experts in the field that can help us in our 3 or 4 questions deep? And then that becomes the difference between empowering people, telling them what they should do, and enabling people, giving them the capability and capacity to do those things. So you could probably take a picture of this screen and say, well, let's go to our leader education and see if that's the things that we do. And if not, how do we check those off and make sure that we're educating the leaders properly? That's what leader training is, not getting them jazzed up. It's getting them the ability, the capacity, and the capability to do the things the leader needs to do. Sorry. So many of you have seen this before. We help the leaders understand that by starting it with the gear model, which views your organization as a machine. Everybody wants the outcomes, but they don't understand that in order to get the workforce to do what you want them to do to improve, the workforce knowledge, or the leader knowledge, language, and behaviors has to change. And then they have to go out and engage, not tell, not teach, not preach, not audit, not observe, engage. And that engagement, the methodology behind that engagement, then starts to drive those better outcomes, whether they're culture, values, and norms, or whether they're safe and stable and reliable operations. But it all starts with leader knowledge, leader language, and behaviors. And I'll give you a hint, and if you're taking notes, you may want to write this down. If your leaders can't pass a simple test on human and organizational performance, then they're not driving human and organizational performance. In other words, the leaders are limiting your capability to do that well sustainably. And what I mean by driving is, if you look at this race car, Kellogg's is a sponsor. We hear, yes, we've got a management sponsor. Yes, we've got a leadership sponsor team. Well, Kellogg sponsors this call. They don't make it successful. All they do is write the check and provide the resources. But if you look closely in that picture, there's a guy in there called Rick Hendrick, who owns Hendrick Motorsports, and they have about 5 cars. There's a huge difference between sponsoring HOP and driving it. Rick Hendrick Motorsports, they make sure that the driver, the crews, the manufacturers have everything that they need, and they know as much about racing that vehicle as the people that are involved. And you can look around at different organizations and you can see the difference between sponsoring or making sure that they support HOP and actually driving it. So we've been educated in the HOP principles, and what we say is they need to be used with intentionality. So if you just think about the principles, error is normal, blame fixes nothing, system drive behaviors, response matters, learning is essential. Those elements are important. And on the one hand, you know, we'll talk to an organization that has been doing HOP, but the leaders don't even know what the principles are. So remember, principle is something that has gone from theory. We think this is pretty good and it'll probably work, to a principle, it's been tried and tested. Even just the phrases have some argumentative characteristics within organizations. We have to be able to explain those elements. So if you think about it, error is normal, has some things that we need to talk about. We need to use science-based definitions. And frankly, I've heard there's people out there changing the definitions because they have trouble getting people to buy into them. That is not a problem with the definition. If you can't get people to buy into the science-based definitions for errors, incidents, violations, deviations, active errors, latent errors, that's an education problem, not the people who are trying to be educated. And I say this with the warmest of hearts. We've educated over 400,000 people that got it. So by saying we now need to change definitions, that's not the problem of the people that are trying to get it. Blame fixes nothing. That has to be treated as a human instinct instead of an organizational problem. In other words, blame can be managed at the individual and leader level. Systems drive behavior. You have to use the task-based system, things like deviation analysis. Response matters. Do we understand our personality tendencies and differences? Do we understand how to use pause and play to turn our reaction into a response? Then learning is vital or essential. You have to have cycles or methods or processes. You have to have things that leaders can do to prove that they are driving human and organizational performance. And so this is just a very short list of those characteristics. But if you think about it, we used to have an event cycle where we'd identify the condition and then we'd blame somebody and then we'd figure out how they violated the rule. Then we'd do a root cause. Then we'd write corrective actions to fix the worker, fix the supervisor, fix the procedure, and retrain. And then we'd start the cycle all over again. But if you think about the new view of safety, and I'm going to, what Bob and us have done for decades, and all you have to really do is plug the new principles in. Error is normal is we've got to understand the definitions of error, violation, deviation, active error. We have to understand the human factors associated with human success and failure. Blame fixes nothing. We can treat blame like it's the 11th error trap. In other words, if we can manage the error traps by understanding the triggers and doing something about it, we can manage blame the same way by using pause and play. Systems influence behavior. We've got the task-based system. We've got a systemic approach to human and organizational performance at the task level that then the leaders can respond based again on using pause and play for whether it's understanding people's performance modes, understanding the task-based system, understanding the systemic drivers, understanding whether they're about to blame or not. And then we can learn the first time, we can learn before bad things happen, and we can learn once. When you help leaders understand that each of the elements of the principles has some very real things to do, they start doing those things. And that's a piece of the education piece. But I don't think we're doing everything we can to prevent some errors, reduce others' probability, and then mitigate the consequences. It seems like there's a whole lot of shifting going on to mitigating consequence. Everything is about the when, not the if, instead of reducing the ifs and reducing the impact of the wins. Next one is that tools for the workforce were either not rolled out or they were rolled out ineffectively. And again, this is another conflict alert. You can't believe everything you've heard about the problems with tools. I'm going to say it again. We've trained over 400,000 people in how to use the tools, and you've got people out there saying that the tools don't work, the workers don't need the tools. And I got to say that these elements, these three elements that you hear a lot of, well, the workers don't need the tools. That's just BS. It's not true. Here's what happens. Somebody says the workers don't need tools or the tools don't work, and then they go give somebody tools that they think would work. You hear people say, oh, you get just as much impact without them. No, that's a triple B, triple S. That's just not true. So let's just take those one by one. The tools, when they're used the right way, help all levels of the organization. So very recently, a few months ago, I was approached by somebody, and they went and got certified in hop and a certified hop trainer, and they were excited about it. I said, that's great. They said, but then I got home and I talked to my dad, and my dad is a worker at a factory that had human performance deployed there 15 years ago. And I started talking about all this hop stuff that I learned. And my dad said, yeah, I know about that. I know about how to recognize when you're vulnerable. I use the traps and the tools every single day. We brief them on the floor. We use the tools to help us reduce probability. And she looked at him and said, you've been using them for 15 years? I said, yeah, they still work. So here we are, 15 years down the road, with a parent telling their daughter something works. There's other people out there telling you they don't work and you don't need them. And I remember years ago, and some of you have read my book, know this story. There was an old crusty pipe fitter, and they knew he was about to retire. He'd been with the company about 40 years. And the only thing had changed was the size of his overalls. He'd brought the same lunchbox to work every day. And one day he got assigned to go help do a task. And the reason they were assigning him is that they did this task every 18 months and they screwed it up every 18 months or so. So they knew from the previous times they may need a pipe fitter. So he was just there to stand around. And the two electricians were they had to crawl down through this pipe chase, and then they could stand up and start working on what they were working on. Well, the one of the electricians said to the other, I think we're supposed to land this jumper now, aren't we? And the other one said, yeah, I'm pretty sure we are. And the first one said, yeah, that's what I remember. We talked about it in the pre-job brief, didn't we? And the other said, yeah, I think we did. Oh, crusty pipe fitter. Now remember, he was in the very last training class for workers that was done at this facility of about 2,000 people. They just didn't think he would accept it or get it. Old crusty pipe fitter says, well, it sounds to me like y'all are in that knowledge mode. And I think you need to stop and figure out whether you're right or not. Said, oh, we're right. We're right. And he said, well, y'all may be right, but I'm going to crawl on out of here because I don't want to find out whether you're right or wrong by something bad happening. And he starts crawling out of the pipe chase. Well, they crawled out after him. They go to the frontline supervisor and he looks at him and says, what are y'all doing here? And the crusty pipe fitter just smiled. And the two guys said, well, we were about to land this jumper. And he said that we weren't right. And he said, that's not what I said. Y'all sent me to training 2 weeks ago that said, if you hear people say, I think, I believe, or I'm pretty sure, you need to stop and get help. And that's what y'all said. So they put the scenario out for the frontline supervisor, and the frontline supervisor said, well, I think you guys are right. We did talk about it in the pre-job brief. And the crusty pipe fitter kind of threw up his hand and said, here we go again. So the supervisor pulls down the prints and pulls out the procedure. What he discovered was had they landed that jumper at that time, before they removed control power to these two other things, it would have sent a signal to a deluge system that is designed to flood that pipe chase in 1 minute. But the tools don't work. Workers don't need them. They don't need the ability to recognize their vulnerability. And I got to tell you, from a personal perspective, the two young electricians, they may have been able to swim their way out of there, but I don't think crusty pipe fitter would have made it out. So there are a ton of stories that back up the need for tools at the workforce level. And if we're going to ask people to try to recognize their vulnerability, we also need to give them the ability to reduce the probability, because the right tool used the right way at the right time reduces error rates in factors of 10. I don't know how people that want the tools not to be used get away with not understanding this. Not only is that the way the science is predicted, that's what the data shows. But no tool or a wrong tool gives no error rate reduction. Well, I guess if you're only mitigating, you don't need to worry about whether people discover that they can or can't. But you have to give a set of specific tools, not this pile on the left. Here's all your tools. There's 17 of them. You got to pick the right one and you got to use the right one right. No. Give a very specific small set of tools and methods for each level of the organization. And guess what? People will use them. That is honoring the vulnerability of the people that get hurt, maimed, and killed out there. So the tools basically move the worker from being empowered to being enabled. We want you to recognize a vulnerability. Now we're going to enable you to deal with it. But you have to provide the tools to the people that actively manage the risk. And I'm not talking about the distal risk. I'm talking about the proximate risk. And this is just me. I have seen exactly 0 sustainable deployments that ignored tools for the workforce. Key word there isn't 0. It's sustainable deployments. These are things that went on for generations of leaders, things that went on for generations of supervisors, things that went on for generations of the workforce. Next one is the organizations think that HOP can be done with little or no workforce education or training. In other words, we're going to do it. We're going to do HOP. I've even heard this. We're going to do HOP, but nobody's going to really know we're doing it. Well, if nobody knows you're doing it, you're not doing it. You're acting like it. You're talking about it. And there's a difference between talking about and doing it. But the success of your HOP deployment is going to be directly proportional to the quality and quantity of your workforce training. When I say workforce, I'm talking top to bottom, senior leaders, managers, frontline supervisors, workers, and again, advocates or champions that are in there to make sure that we've got some subject matter experts in the field that are 3 or 4 questions deep. The senior leaders, after they get educated, they need some soak time. In that time, they're changing their language and behaviors. And the interesting thing is, and they love this, you can tell them, look, you got time to screw it up because nobody knows what you're supposed to be doing. You don't have the pressure of the organization to get it right. And then the managers start the advocate selection criteria. Who are going to be our subject matter experts in the field? And how do we shift our knowledge, language, and behaviors so that as we start training the front line at the leader level, then we can start to integrate the concepts into the day-to-day workflow so the workers can start to then see and manage risk better. And this is just a typical deployment model. It's what I just said, that the senior leaders get educated and have soak time, then the managers and advocates get trained, and then you start to integrate the concepts and you do some train the trainer. Now, train the trainer's changed in the last 4 or 5 years. COVID proved that we can use advocates to facilitate pre-prepared videos and materials as opposed to having advocates that become trainers that are word by word trainers that are training 8-hour classes. So there's been a lot of improvements in the way the supervisor, frontline leader, and worker education gets deployed. So if you think about this as a formula, we want to reduce errors and mistakes. We want to maximize the defenses. We want to mitigate the consequences. If we do all those well, we've got a strong safety culture. We've got good psychological safety, and we are reducing incidents and near misses and close calls. But all of these have elements that need to be done to basically do HOP right. You have to teach people about error prevention and error reduction and reducing probability and understanding the science-based definition and performance modes. In order to reduce errors and their probability, those are the elements that need to happen. When you're maximizing defenses, you can use the error reduction tools as the final layer of protection. How are we going to manage the systems? Are we creating effective written guidance that either mitigates consequence or doesn't drive errors? Are we using performance hazard recognition as well as we're using physical hazard recognition. We'll talk about that in a minute. And then, are we mitigating consequences? How are we recognizing risks so it can be dealt with earlier in the process? How are we assessing the hazards so that they can be mitigated? Are we using leader tools like the essential leadership cycle? Are we learning from incidents in normal work? And then what happens is your safety culture goes up, your numbers go down, and your quality goes up, including your quality of analysis, learning, and corrective actions. All of those things happen as the result of doing the things that need to be done to create an effective HOP element. But people have to learn to do those things. You can't ignore the education piece, and it has to be done right. The next one is that organizations think they're deploying without integrating. And what happens is they deploy without integrating, and they may have some blips, some improvements, but it doesn't result in sustainable positive outcomes. And here's another conflict. Because I got to tell you, if I hear one more person talk about integration that couldn't spell it 2 years ago, much less knows how to do it, and that well is, I don't know what I'm going to do. Because remember, I'm tired of chasing shiny objects. What people are doing is they're pulling terms that work out of the air and they're loading it into this is how we do HOP, but there's no strategy for integration. I mean, as I shared, we had our FIT client conference in last week, and we had major organizations from all over the world come in. Most of what they talked about was that the education strategy was right, but the integration was what made them stay around 5, 10, 15, 18 years later. So you can't just say integration. You have to know exactly what an integration strategy looks like. And what that looks like is you have education, integration, and a poorly spelled sustainability. And then you have the leadership and workforces and processes and systems get integrated. What that does automatically is it increases your organizational capacity and resilience. And then a highly reliable organization with sustainably improved performance is the outcome of those elements. So we have to reduce errors and incidents, but it doesn't need to be a new program. It's a new way of thinking and behaving. We have to integrate that risk awareness and error reduction mitigation concepts into your practices so it becomes yours. Never do this to people. We should be doing it together. Then we've got to obtain the capability to do this inside. In other words, you shouldn't have to rely on somebody from outside for too long. They need to teach you how to do it, make sure that you do it well, and then get out of your way. You may need some ongoing support, but it needs to be yours, not somebody else's.
Hey, Rob, it's
Yeah,
a good time for a couple of questions, if I
sure.
might. So one is in the chat box, do you believe there's a direct correlation between operational reliability and improved safety performance?
Absolutely. And here's what we say. You can be safe without being operationally excellent, but you can't be operationally excellent without being safe. So it's not a one-to-one. There's a lot of places out there that focus a lot on safety. They're a train wreck when it comes to running their performance. I mean, we've gone into organizations that have done lean and they've deployed HOP, their safety numbers, and not just the numbers, their safety culture and everything around it get better. And they save $3.2 million a quarter, and they'd already done lean Six Sigma before that. So operational excellence, which is what we tend to focus on now, brings safety along with it, brings quality along with it, brings HR along with it, brings maintenance along with it. But safety, and one of our challenges, Dean, is that once you're focusing on safety, we're creating the very silos that people are trying to eliminate. So safety is a piece of that pie, of the operational excellence pie. Interestingly enough, it's tougher the other way around. Does that help?
Got it. It does. Thank you. And one more question for you, because we're on the bit of a topic about deploying and how you do it. And you just used the word silo, so it triggered a question in my mind. When you think about organizations making big, bold, breakthrough kind of changes, and as that relates to deploying Hop, have you seen more effectiveness as like deploying Hop organization wide, or in chunks of an organization to get traction and demonstrate success and that kind of thing?
Absolutely. Oh, that was an or and it's not an
It
or.
was.
It's actually an and we had some
Okay.
great conversations last week about this. Here's something I'll tell the folks that are on here you should never do. Never call it a pilot. You're going to do a phased approach. Now that phased approach may be, so we've got one client that is deploying by region, one plant per region right now. We've got another that is deploying by country, one country. We've got another that is deploying. Here's our 5 top plants, and we're going to deploy in number 1 for phase 1 in a plant that is always leading the charge. And we've got another client that says, yeah, that'd be great, but we'd rather do it in our worst case scenario. And if it works there, people will go, it worked there, it'll work anywhere. That's about sitting down with someone and developing that strategy. It has to be done right to work right, but all those strategies are already developed. There is no one right way to do that. Does that help?
It does. Thank you. Okay. I appreciate it.
So if we look at education, integration, and sustainability, education starts with all the things that people need to be taught. Integration is a little more work. We need to create integration teams within our champions or advocates. And then sustainability is how do we put this in our systems so it becomes how we do business? On the way, we're developing capacity and resilience. Those aren't the methods, they're the outcomes. And in order to do that from the education integration place, you need to have some online or on your LMS, some virtual, maybe some classroom, some field. We can mix all of those together. You can mix all of those together nowadays better than we've ever been able to in the past. The next one is that leaders don't have a system or a process so that they can lead intentionally. Many of y'all have heard of the Essential Leadership Cycle, and I'll talk about it in a minute. If you type Essential Leadership Cycle podcast into any search engine, I've interviewed, I think, 64 senior leaders on how they use the Essential Leadership Cycle to help manage all of these things that are going on out there. We've done pretty good with physical hazards, but you need to shift to the performance hazards so that we're looking at both of those. We call this now the Essential Task Cycle, where we surround the task-based system where people are challenged by other people, programs, processes, work environments, organization, equipment, and surround those with the physical hazards. And then the Essential Leadership Cycle is a model that helps leaders manage all of those task-based systems. I just wanted to show real quickly something we're doing a little bit different. As many of y'all know, Todd Conklin and I kind of sat over in Norway and developed an understanding of adaptability that was different than the way drift was being talked about. That then became known as black line and blue line. But what hasn't been done, and the way we're talking about this now, is that each of those pieces of adaptability, that adaptability is driven by something in the task-based system. So if we can get the workers to talk about that, we understand that if you believe Deming, and I think you should, there's a 90% probability this adaptability at each level is systemically driven. The workers will tell us what those control limits are if we go ask them the right questions. So how do we ask questions differently? How do we use understanding adaptability to get the workers to tell us where they need to adapt beforehand so that we don't reduce margin of safety? And 2 of those ways that you're probably familiar with are the 4 Ds. Now, we recommend they're done in an order because different personalities look at these things differently. Are we asking you to do something dumb, different, difficult, or dangerous? Or when something bad happens, you shouldn't be asking people why they did it. You should be asking them to tell you explain to you, describe to you, and show you. And that will give you the gap answers to the whys that the analyst can then use to understand it. But you can't just tell people we need to ask better questions. We need to give them the questions to ask, pat them on the butt, send them out in the field, and let them ask it. So we use a model called deviation analysis. And here's the challenge. Deviation analysis is understanding how and why people deviate from any rule, standard, or expectation. And you may notice it looks a lot like some models that you've seen in the past. The question is, how is it run? So if you think about it, if you call something an accountability model, what do the workers think you're trying to do to it? Oh, it gets worse. If you call it a culpability model, what the hell do they think you're trying to do to it? But if you're trying to get them to help you analyze the deviations, help us find the systemic drivers that produce the outcomes. And then at the end, you're worried less about what you're going to do to them than identifying the elements that you're going to change in your systems to prevent those deviations or outcomes again. I will tell you this from personal experience, the workforce is all in. And that's because you're not trying to hold them accountable by the model, and you're not trying to hold them culpable by the model. We are trying to improve the performance of the understanding. Then the leaders can go out and do these values-based engagements. In other words, they're out there talking about things without watching work. But you have to teach them how to do that. Do we have a values match or a values mismatch? Are we verifying that we all understand the mission, vision, and goals? So again, if you like taking pictures of slides, from the top 5 HOP deployment errors, here's your top 5 HOP go-dos. Educate the leaders and give them the new language and behaviors you want them to use every day, so they're driving the improvements. The next one is to roll out the right tools, very deliberate, very intentionally, and based on the science. We know what ones work. We know how they work. We know what tool works for what thing, and we know how many really do work. So there needs to be some intentionality behind it. You need to design and deliver your workforce education and training based on proven models. I can't tell you the amount of times I've watched organizations struggle for years with how they're going to train the workforce when people already know what works in training the workforce. But this whole not invented here in the HOP space just means you're going to be two shiny objects down the road before you're ever ready to try to put it out there. And then at your facilities, at your company, at your sites, form an integration team of advocates and leaders that will tell you how to put it into day-to-day work. How do our daily management boards fit in? Where does this fit into our daily management boards? Where does it fit into our tail boards? Where does it fit into our leadership morning meetings? The workforce, once they're educated, the workforce has all kinds of ideas on how you can get people to use it every day. And let's go back to the family story from earlier. That individual was able to show his daughter exactly how they discussed it in their morning meetings and talk about when they stopped and had another discussion during the day. That's 15 years after they deployed the concepts. And then you have to start leading with intentionality based on the science and go out and do values-based engagements. We have an offering called Fit Online. It's free, and we have probably 300 different pieces of free content. Everything that I talked about today is in a 2 to 5 minute video. There are also some intermediates, and here's what I'm going to offer to the folks that are on the call. I'm going to give you a QR code to join Fit Online. If you go in there and poke around and you think that you want one of our paid courses, if you'll send me an email, tell me you were on this webinar, we will gift you that course. Because understand there's 3 vital things. And again, maybe it's either picture time or note time. Number 1, if you want to change somebody's paradigm, you got to give them a paradigm more powerful than the one you're asking them to leave. And very often We can't do that if that person is above us in an organization. The second one is if you can get leaders to use models, processes, and tools, the workers will. If you can't get leaders to use models, processes, and tools, the workers won't either. In other words, you're not going to get the sustainable outcomes. The third one is important because a lot of HOP gets construct around just learning. But the problem is you can't correct your way to excellence. You can only correct your way to average. You have to prevent and reduce probability to be excellent. So that has to be a part of your HOP journey. Because HOP is a holistic approach to improving and reducing and mitigating risk. So don't limit yourself to the shiny object. You have to look at it from the perspective of the end game is us creating a psychologically safe, operationally excellent, capable, and resilient organization. And in order to do that, you have to do all the things that produce it, not one thing, and then say, well, we'll get there eventually. You're not going to get there. So one of the things that I did a while back was I recorded about a 7-minute observation on the top 5 HOP deployment errors. This QR code or that website gets you to that on our YouTube channel. If you have somebody in your organization that you'd like to hear some of the things we talked about, but doesn't have an hour to spare, I talk about most of those things in the HOP top 5 HOP top, whatever that says right there. That's what that QR code goes to. So is the QR code fully visible, Dean, or is it cut off somehow?
It is. It works perfectly.
Okay. Perfect. So I'll give you a minute to get that QR code and get that website and get it saved. And then again, I want to thank you for having me and allowing me to teach a little, educate a little, vent a little. And the Fit Online, again, if you join it for free, or if you're already a member and you haven't gone back in a while, go pick around in the insights, and maybe you want to have a discussion about somebody in leadership about some of those things, because almost everything we talk about is there in a 2 to 5 minute video. And then if you choose to want to take one of our paid courses, we will gift that course to you. So now I'd like to open it up for any questions, comments, clarifications, and just any input that you have. I hope this was helpful for folks today. I mean, obviously the community of human organizational learning is very close to our hearts and what we see it doing in the world and the amount of people that it can actually touch. And I look forward to the conference next year. Any questions, comments, clarifications?
Well, you've already gotten some appreciative feedback, Rob, so thank you very much. And also a couple questions about sharing the presentation and the video, which we've already addressed. So that's awesome. And you're getting more appreciative feedback. So I think your venting was a very good thing. So the discussion around what are we talking about and how to deploy HOP effectively, I think is awesome. So we'll just pause there for a minute to see if people want to raise their hands or chat questions into the chat box. I see Bob Latino is unmuted. So Bob, you have a question.
Thanks, Rob. Great presentation. I can certainly relate to it coming from a reliability engineering world. I guess I'm seeking advice. Typically, when people view HOP, they associate it with safety. So when it comes into a major corporation through the safety route, the C-suite of safety, most of the people in reliability pucker up because they wonder if they're going to have to adopt something that is new to them that would replace what they feel is working for them. But from my own experience, the HOP principles in a holistic reliability world are perfectly aligned. So what is your advice to somebody who is in a reliability engineering field when they see HOP coming down the pike through the safety vertical?
Well, I think it's much simpler than we've made it. So we focus on HOP unless we're going in that other door. and then it's called human factors. So everything that we talked about here is now in the human factors ASQ manual 13,100 and 13,010 for aerospace. So going in that quality or engineering door is much easier when the stuff that we're talking about, maybe you don't talk about it just from a hop perspective, because again, we've been chasing this shiny object since it was, Deming's principles. So we talk about H&OP a lot, but if somebody thinks that's a safety program, shift and talk about the human factors or human success and failure, and then go over to those ASQ documents and say, look, this is all in here. You go to the maritime documents, the TMSI and the OMICF, those contain the human factors attributes. It's just HOP under a different name. Yeah. So if people think that HOP is just safety, maybe rather than trying to talk them out of it, you put everybody in the room. So when we go in and do a senior leader workshop, probably 70% of the time we're brought in the safety door is what we call it. But we don't talk to anybody unless the VPs are in the room, operations is in the room, engineering's in the room, human resources in the room, union's in the room if it's a union workshop, and oh, by the way, safety's there. And then that chat, people see immediately. And I'm talking, we're not even out of the room. And all those people, the quality people, are talking about how it can be used. So it's all in the people that you gather, not the door you come in. Does that help at all, Bob?
Yeah, I mean, I've been involved with this group now for about 9 years, and what I've come to learn is that there's just two different dictionaries that confuse people, because principle-wise, the 5 principles of HOP are not related to any specific industry or department. That we're all in the same thing, especially when you're looking at reliability and safety, because you're both in the loss prevention business. And you're both, fortunately or unfortunately, success is measured by what doesn't happen, which is not a lot of glorified, a lot of attention you get for recognition for things that don't happen.
Well, and interestingly enough, in the quality world, those measurements are quick, they're easy, and they're obvious. So once those quality folks walk out the door, and you've got a few quality advocates, one of the things that we've learned about ourselves is that we now look at things, because our mission is improving companies and lives. But we also realized in the last few weeks that millions of people rely on us, but few know who we are. And all of that is in a safety realm. Safety, even fatality, serious injury elimination, is almost a part and parcel role of operational excellence that includes all of those things. It's a great question, Bob.
Okay, thanks. I didn't mean to take up so much oxygen from everybody else.
Well, we do have time for one more. So the question is, Rob, what do you think about like a maturity model, a life cycle model, to continuously gauge where an organization is in terms of HOP maturity or HOP deployment, or both? Yeah.
So we already have about 5 or 7 of those developed. And the HOP maturity, maybe it's a HOP integration assessment, or a HOP maturity model, or a human factors integration assessment, or those are all already developed and they're tried and true. Another thing we discovered from these 30 or so clients that we had in last week is every one of them was using a version that had been a little wording had been changed, but they were using versions of our maturity models that they'd had for several years. So those are out there. If somebody wants to contact us and have a discussion about what those look like, y'all have all of our information. So yes, awesome. It's absolutely necessary in organizations that are diverse geographically, that are diverse through what they do, or even in a plant that is pretty large, to understand where they're at, whether they're in the beginning phase or ground zero, whether they're in the maturing phase, whether they have matured, whether they're at their target condition. All of those are already built out for every element that you need to think about for deploying HOP.
And it's not a similar question, but I suspect a similar answer, that you've already got this kind of information or insights or guidance available, Rob. But there's a question about tips and tools that may be helpful in using with senior leaders to help them understand HOP and deployment without, so here's a quote, without safety telling them how to do their jobs. I suspect you have those kind of tips and tools available.
Yeah, and a lot of them are free on Fit Online. You can kind of poke through, you can take the, so for instance, there's a observation in there said, why can't we just get people to stop? So if you got a leader that keeps saying that, you can go there, you can cogitate on it, or you can maybe sit down with them and watch it. There's a webinar on moving beyond unsafe acts and unsafe behaviors. So sometimes we've got leaders that keep throwing those out. Well, there's a webinar on there for free on how do we move beyond it. So yeah, I really encourage people to go poke around in that. We created it so that the community could learn, not as a profit center for us. So we hope you'll use that. The long answer is yeah, it's all there.
That's awesome, and we appreciate that. And so Chef Dalto, I'll respond to your question in the chat box about when the information will be available. Rob, we're out of runway. So thank you very much. Thank you very much for, just sharing your time and your wisdom and insights, both during this hour, but also what you've made available online, because it's just super helpful. And a quick public service announcement from Community of Human and Organizational Learning. We have our upcoming conference in June, and we have a call for presenters that's wide open. So if any of you have insights that you want to share in this forum, in this conference coming up in June, or you are thinking about it, please feel free to submit with the link that I just shared in the chat box, or reach out to me and ask about your topic and how it may fit with the organization, because we'd love to see you there. And Rob, again, most importantly, thank you for your time.